field is also here. Okay, I think we can start. Oh, I don't know, maybe I can break the ice. Start. Okay, so first thing, so you believe that hyperintensional properties or relations are a representation, so that they are not part of the world, but rather part of the way that we represent the world.
Well, I mean, of course, representations are themselves part of the world, but
Yeah.
yes, but I think when one, I mean, for example, if one's talking about something that um is not um is not just part of language or thought, then I think there can be intention, that can be, as it were, real world intentionality, but not real world hyperintentionality. That things like, so that, for example, if you have necessarily equivalent predicates, then they express the same property or relation.
Yeah, I think that there's, I was thinking about whether we can find some counterexamples to this idea. I think that I have one prima facie convincing uphill and downhill. So, well, if X is uphill, if and only if X is downhill. And
Um,
so that has to do obviously with the direction of our movements, but it seems that there are objective properties in the world. So going uphill with a car, you consume more fuel. With going downhill, you are using your brakes, and so the uphill and downhill seem to be parts of the world.
yeah, but well, I mean, it's so if you um so if we take your example of the car going uphill or going downhill, so those are definitely different things, and that's not just some linguistic representation. But um, if if you if you take the the uphill there as I mean, it's basically being, when you say the car is going downhill, you're using downhill as an adverb, and so typically, the semantics of adverbs might be that they're expressing properties of events or something like that, and as in, if you were giving a Davidsonian treatment of adverbs, and the and so um the events that we're interested in here are events of motion, and one property of motion is that it's a motion downhill, which means that you're higher up at earlier times than at later times during the motion, and um, and and then that if you're going downhill, and then opposite and uphill is the other way round. So, when you think of uphill and downhill as expressing properties of motions, of events of movement, then they're simply um, incompatible properties. So a movement that is downhill isn't uphill, and vice versa. So that actually uphill and downhill, understood in that way, would in fact be extensionally distinct.
Mhm, 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 mhm. Yeah, it will be a line of answer. Yeah. Thanks. So Ksenia has unfortunately to leave us earlier. So Ksenia.
Thank you very much. Well, my first question is about precisely it has to do with scientific theories and with the degenerativeness of some of theories that you have discussed. You discuss specifically justified true belief, but when applied to scientific theories, it's not clear. You obviously follow an intuition that a good theory should be maybe not simple, but you tend towards elegant explanations, elegant theories. But as a counter example to justify true belief, you take theories in semantics that developed in 20th century, and you argue that those are good developments, they are fruitful, and further developments about justified true belief are degenerative. And now I see your line of argument, but when we speak of scientific theories, for example, particle in physics. I had an example, just a second. Well, the question is, when do we, based on what do we abandon a theory? Because there are many theories that are extremely complex. And do you think that there is a level of complexity such that in itself, it should push us against the theory? Or would you agree that we abandon a theory when we gather enough data to support a development of new theory? I don't know if I made.
So I don't think it can all be data driven. I mean, I agree that that sometimes theories do get complicated, but I think the key thing is that every extra layer of complication is a cost, and that we should, as we're only be willing to make a theory more complicated when there are really powerful reasons for doing so. And I think this is quite close to the idea that there's something bad with ad hoc theories. And I think in science, often this sort of criterion of simplicity is doing a lot of work, kind of behind the scenes in determining which theories scientists will even take seriously. So, for example, if you had some theory that, let's say that the general relativity is correct, except for events happening in Oxford on Christmas Day 1983. I mean, that's just where, and for those for that place and time, Newtonian physics works. I mean, that's simply a ridiculous theory that no scientist would ever want to take seriously, and it's ridiculous because it's got this kind of pointless complexity to it. So it's being eliminated on those kind of grounds before even really getting any kind of serious consideration, which it obviously doesn't deserve. And I think in terms of theories that are have a more realistic chance of being taken by seriously by scientists. This idea of overfitting, it's not a philosopher's invention. It comes from scientific practice, and it's overfitting is a kind of pathology which scientists recognize, and they recognize it because of the things like the introduction of new parameters into a theory in a very liberal kind of way, just in order to fit the data. So that the problem with these overfitted theories is not that they don't, well, it's not that they don't fit the current data. But there's a lot of reason to expect that they won't fit new data, because that's typically what happens with these overfitted theories. But they're being, as it were, rejected, not on the grounds of actual failure of fit with specific evidence that we possess, but rather just with the expectation that if you do your theorizing in this kind of way, even though in a way, in a sense, it's motivated by the the pressure to fit the data. In the long run, it's not it doesn't actually produce very good results in that respect. But this is a kind of projection on into the what we can expect from future data. Because of the overfitting that's going on in the theory construction. So it's actually, it's not in fact to do with the some kind of lack of fit with the current data. It's rather that we expect on more theoretical grounds that there'll be a lack of fit with future data.
Yes, well, I have my second question is actually in line with this one, and I have it written, fortunately, so I won't have to make it up. I will just read it, and it has a lot to do with what you just said. And I agree, of course, none of our theories should start with this theory is probably going to work for everything except in Oxford on Christmas. But well, here is my question, and I will just read it. So I take Kuhn's work on and his explanation how science progresses through paradigms, where paradigms are universally accepted models that define research problems and solution. And before a paradigm is established, of course, our inquiry is primarily guided by curiosity, by common sense and practical concerns, but once accepted, paradigms drive researchers towards highly specialized, very precise, and both Levy and Kuhn actually use word obscure and counterintuitive investigations. So it's not about that we start with the supposition that the theory will work mostly in all cases except for Oxford on Christmas Day, but sometimes we just arrive at such conclusions during the inquiry time. And post-paradigm science advances rapidly precisely because researchers focus on predefined problems rather than questioning fundamentals and rather than relying on common sense. And they treat research as puzzle solving. That's from Levy 2003. The progress, of course, comes with that cost that you mentioned. And I would even go as far as to say that overfitting is somehow inevitable byproduct of doing science in that way. Yet that is, as far as I know, the only way that we manage to do science successfully. And paradigms in science shift when new data accumulates, and that forces reconsideration. I here took the example of Lynn Margulis's endosymbiotic theory that she developed in 1967. The theory was not only dismissed initially, it was rejected 15 times by different journals, and it was ridiculed, only to become a cornerstone of evolutionary biology in 1980s. So scientific paradigms, yes, of course, they grow, they become fruitful, they come to overfitting, and they become overcome by new data. So my question is essentially, how do you see the analogy for this process in philosophy?
Yeah, well, so first of all, on your description of Kuhn's account, I mean, one thing that Kuhn emphasizes is that every paradigm is faced with various, and as he calls them, anomalies, and so these anomalies generally consist of well, I mean, not always, but often there'll be data about some particular kind of case, which is actually very hard to reconcile with the paradigm. And Kuhn's description of what goes on is that in effect, people working on the paradigm, they kind of work with the hope that sooner or later these anomalies will be resolved,
Yes.
and what they don't do is kind of revise the paradigm in order to achieve some kind of cheap reconciliation with the anomalies. They leave them as anomalies and kind of hope for the best. And Kuhn argues that in effect this is actually quite an efficient and rational way of proceeding, because it actually enables the full explanatory power of the paradigm to be explored, and that it won't be dismissed prematurely. And and on his account, um, it's not really the new data by themselves that force the paradigm to be rejected. It's rather that you get, I mean, it may be some new data may be involved in this process, but what you have are attempts to explain the new data within the old paradigm, which don't really work out, and then you have some new paradigm, which is a new theory that that can explain these data far better than the old paradigm, where and it will. This all takes time. It won't be that people will immediately rush and dump the old theory and rush to the new paradigm. I mean, they will, as it were, do their best to understand the new data in a more conservative way. But if eventually those attempts don't work out, and the new theory has got a very elegant explanation for what's going on, then people will gradually switch to it. And so so it's not a completely data-driven sort of account, and it's not one which really pictures scientists as engaging in anything like overfitting. And I mean, I think that kind of picture of theoretical activity is quite appropriate in philosophy as well. I mean, we don't have data in the sense of big data sets of quantitative measurements or whatever it is, but we're still, I mean, there's still a lot of, as it were, facts that of described at a lower level that we're we need to account for with the theory, and some of these are may take the form in philosophy of thought experiments, and and kind of some sort of compelling verdict on a given thought experiment. So I think that this is that philosophy proceeds in a way which is at a very kind of big picture level, it's really not so different from what Kuhn is describing. Although, of course, I think that Kuhn is, I mean, he's not as it were, describing scientists as engaging in overfitting, and whereas I think that philosophers philosophers are more guilty than a lot of scientists in quickly going to overfitting, because they need some consciousness raising about the problems that such a methodology causes.
Yes, yeah, I do apologize. I did not attribute to Kuhn that sentence when I said that it seems to me, just that it was my thought. It seems to me that paradigm-driven science necessarily leads to overfitting. But yes, in science, new data, at least in some cases, manages to exclude alternative explanations, which I don't think in philosophy is quite possible in that particular way.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, but what part of what Kuhn is arguing is that this excluding of other theories is not something as simple as you might think. If you thought of it in the way that a kind of crude Popperian falsificationist would think of it. I mean, he's arguing that on the one hand, there's always the possibility of having doubts about whether these data are actually correct, whether whether there was something went wrong in the data gathering process. But he's also, and maybe more importantly, allowing that that there may be something going on with the data that I mean, where we're making assumptions which are not, as it were, intrinsic to the paradigm itself, but assumptions about what's going on in this process and interpreting the data. And it may be that those auxiliary assumptions later get rejected, and it turns out that actually the theory can accommodate the data, so that I don't. It's not a simple matter of just excluding certain theories because that they're refuted by the data. It's a much more complicated process than that, and it's also part of this view that you don't get a shift away from the old paradigm until there's some new paradigm that's doing better. I mean, and I think it would very rarely be the case that as it were the new paradigm that scientists switched to was in any danger of overfitting. I mean, it's of course it's not that you're never allowed to introduce some new variable. I mean occasionally that is a good thing to do. But I think natural and social scientists are rightly very reluctant to do it, and I don't think that the kind of process of scientific revolutions that Kuhn is describing leads to anything like overfitting. I mean, it's often the new paradigms find new ways of being quite simple, and as in, for example, if you take the Newtonian revolution, then and Newton managed to give a unified theory of motion that applied both to terrestrial motion and to celestial motion, and so that was actually that the kind of unification is actually a simplifying process. So it wasn't that he had to make things all much more complicated, and if you take the Kepler's astronomy, the move away from geocentric to heliocentric astronomical theories, in the long run, it led to great increases in simplicity. I mean, because they could get rid of all the epicycles that people had been relying on, and that was one of the reasons why the Ptolemaic astronomy was so unsatisfactory. And the way that epicycles kept having to be added, I mean, that's a classic example of overfitting.
Okay, Philip, one question, please. We'll go in circle until we drop that.
Okay. First of all, thanks for having us. Well, I was wondering about the individuation of heuristics. So how do we individuate them in philosophy and metaphysics? For example, is the mutual inconsistency between the libertarian and compatibilist meaning of could have done otherwise a heuristic or a clash of heuristics, much like the mutual inconsistency of opposing counterfactuals? Could it be that our notion of a material object, the so-called object talk, is a heuristic as well? It functions properly with chairs and tables, but not as well when we are dealing with energy particles or galaxies. So it is reliable in most cases, but not in all. So could that be heuristics? And related to this question, I have further one that basically grounded in the same line of reasoning. So it seems that we could say that many of our philosophical debates are actually some kind of clash of heuristics, or perhaps even illusory problems. But wouldn't such a solution be perhaps too radical, that we would eliminate a great part of philosophy in that way, perhaps? So the essential question then is, how can we determine whether we are dealing with a genuine philosophical problem or merely a clash of heuristics? So,
yeah, well, So of course, this issue about how you individuate heuristics, it arises in psychology as well, because I mean, in fact, psychologists were talking about heuristics really, but as such, but before the philosophers were, and I I don't think that that there's any very kind of neat ex, answer to that. I mean, any more than there are kind of neat answers to the question like how do you individuate habits or something, because which is not totally unrelated to heuristics, because we're talking about in effect habits of thought. So one thing that you said that which was sort of contrasting, as you put it, I think genuine philosophical problems with just a clash of heuristics. My view that and what I'm arguing in the book is that actually it's heuristics, not necessarily a clash of heuristics, but it's heuristics that are responsible for a lot of philosophical problems, because these heuristics are, I think, the ones that are philosophically most interesting are ones that are maybe even humanly universal, or at least that they're very widespread in certain cultures, and perhaps over a wide range of cultures, and so these are kind of ways of thinking, of of reasoning that are kind of in some ways very efficient, and that people rely on, but that then although they're quite efficient, they're not 100% reliable. And then the philosophical problems come because ingenious thinkers find ways of exploiting the heuristics to get us into contradictions. And you can do that because the heuristics are not completely reliable, and even if they're in fact in principle inconsistent, they could still be reliable sort of 95% of the time, or whatever. And so the heuristics that I'm talking about, these are not things that, as it were generally were invented by philosophers. These are ways of thinking that are tempting to either to pretty much all human beings, or maybe to human beings in a lot of cultures like ours, or whatever. And the trouble is that the fact that you're using a heuristic doesn't automatically enable you to know that what you're using is just a heuristic. And so these actually feel like very compelling ways of thinking, and when we have to understand what these ways of thinking are, and once we've understood them, we can often see that they're not going to be 100% reliable. So I don't think that one can just also, as it were, give a cheap solution to a philosophical problem by saying, well, this is just a heuristic. I mean, of course, if it's a particular, if it's something very specific to the problem, like specific to the problem of free will or something, then that's likely to be something that philosophers can quite easily recognize as a distinctive theoretical move that you can reject, and so on. I think in a way the deeper philosophical problems come from things which are much more deeply ingrained in human thinking, and they're ingrained because they're really quite efficient most of the time, and it can take a lot of work to become aware of them. But also I mean, once you do formulate them, you can see that that although these are not going to be 100% reliable, they actually are going to be reliable most of the time, and so that's why we've evolved to use these ways of thinking because of their comparative efficiency. And so I think it's not just that you can solve any old philosophical problem by saying, oh, we must be relying on a heuristic here. You actually have to say what the heuristic is, and I think and you've got to make it plausible that human beings would be relying on such a heuristic, and and for that it has to be something that's actually useful a lot of the time, and and so I think that there's quite a lot of there's quite a high bar to postulating a heuristic in that sense. Um, and so that you have to do some of that work, which in the book with the heuristics that I've been postulating, I've actually attempted to do some work to show why it's not at all surprising that we'd be using a heuristic of this kind, and that it's a very general kind of heuristic. It's not something that is only going to be manifest in philosophy itself.
Well, thanks.
No.
So just if I may ask a little bit further. Well, it seems to me that then part of philosophy, if we are all relying on finding out heuristics, would be one of the, so let's say, goal of philosophy would be to disentangle problems by showing that they are not about the world, but that are rather by our way of thinking of the world. And wouldn't that be perhaps a bit problematic for some problems that we are, how can I say, think that are world dependent and not mind dependent?
Well, can you give an example of what you
I
have
don't know. I'm thinking about the free will debate constantly because that's what I'm working on. And for example, the experimental philosophy program has been also used to see if someone can disentangle the debate in some way, but it failed. And then again, here when we are talking about the could have done otherwise, it seems like a way of talking about in a specific context, the compatibility that in one, the libertarian is in another. Isn't perhaps that just a heuristic? If it is, especially because it seems that we have also an overfitting problem there, because when you watch the debate, when you read about it, then you see the things get extremely complicated. Things are added on, and all these cases, all these imaginary examples have to be fitted in a single notion of what it means that one could have done otherwise. So it seems that you have overfitting, and that perhaps the reply could be, okay, we're dealing with two heuristics, one which is grounded in a compatibilistic notion of could have done otherwise, and the other in the libertarian notion of could have been done otherwise. And there the clash occurs, and then actually we do not have a problem of free will. We have a problem with how we think about free will.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of, if we're talking about anything like a philosophical paradox or whatever, then there is going to be, I mean, part of the solution is going to be to show what was wrong with the ways of thinking that led into this paradox, and of course that doesn't mean that the issues that we're talking, or the phenomena that we're talking about, are not out there in the world. I mean, that if and I mean, human beings are acting, and at least for a given sense of the term free will, they either have free will or they don't, and that's a worldly fact. But I mean, so if, for example, you were mentioning the phrase "could have done otherwise," and that's a phrase that uses could, which is it's basically the past tense of can, of course, and it's and so that's a typical modal verb, and so there's a lot to be said about just how we use to talk of ability and possibility. I mean, possibility modals like can. And by the way, can is as it were it stands for some kind of objective, although fairly restricted modality. I mean, when you talk about what people can do or what something can do, you're talking about objective possibilities, not simply about ignorance of something. And so that I think that, I mean, I'm not going to offer my diagnosis of the free will problem or anything, but I, one thing that definitely you would be relevant is to understand more just about the general use of modals such as can and able to and so on, and to take that away from the particular philosophical discussion of free will into a context where one's actually trying to understand in a very general way how we talk about what people could have done. I mean, could he have reached the bottle of wine on the shelf, or whatever. And I think that's a more appropriate sort of setting for understanding the use of talk about could have done otherwise, rather than just trying to produce sort of ad hoc philosophical theories about that one particular phrase, which is just one particular one application of a much wider way of thinking about objective modalities. And it's very likely that in applying such terms that some kind of heuristic is being used, and then that would be something that we could investigate.
Well, talking about heuristics, there is at the beginning of the book for Sorites paradoxes. So the heuristic is supposed to be that the small difference doesn't matter.
Yes.
Well, on the one hand, it looks perfectly plausible. However, on the other hand, when you are teaching the Sorites paradoxes, or when you are talking with people on the street, and when you make the point of Sorites paradoxes, then many people naturally, spontaneously move from this either-or approach to some kind of a gradual approach. Say that if you move one grain of sand, is it still a heap? Well, yes, it is a 0.999999 heap. If you remove another, oh yes, it is 0.998 of the heap, or 0.999 true, or something. So people from this either-or, people very spontaneously and naturally easily switch to this, let's say, gradual approach. And the fact that it is so seems that does not fit with the idea that little difference doesn't matter. It's really heuristics, like Miller-Lyer's illusion. We can't help it. In the case of Miller-Lyer illusion, we still see the difference. We can't help ourselves. However, in the case of this little difference doesn't matter, people spontaneously and easily give up of that approach. So
yeah. So I mean, the reason that we can't help it in the case of the Miller-Lyer is because that's the relevant heuristic is one that is built into our perceptual system, so that it's not under conscious control. Whereas the kind of heuristics that I think are more relevant to philosophical problems are ones of a more general cognitive kind, and so that so they're ones that are at work just in our ordinary reasoning about things, and that's something that is under much more conscious control. And so we do have this kind of flexibility, and and of course we're very familiar with gradual processes and so on. I mean, all I think invoking numbers like 0.9999 and so on, that's more culturally specific thing, because obviously people who haven't been trained in at least some high school mathematics are not going to say that, but they but of course even people who haven't done that, they can say things about how it's a gradual process. But the paradox, I mean, people can see that there's a problem fairly quickly, although once you alert them to the the existence of a Sorites paradox, they'll see that this is something that is a process of gradual change and so on, and they'll kind of flounder around with trying to give alternative descriptions that are less problematic, and and if you don't focus on the question of whether it's a heap, you can say, I mean, you can just say things like, well, it's gradually becoming less of a heap and so on, but I mean, we know from all the debates on vagueness that those kind of things don't automatically deliver any solution to the Sorites paradox, and and the difficulty is that the people will, I mean, what they do is they kind of regard it as as silly to say that that you can have a heap where taking one grain away will make it not a heap, and the fact that they're resisting that is it's not that it's not just that they're required to do it because it's a gradual process. I mean, because if you're talking about a gradual process in more precise terms, you don't get into that issue. It's that they're the kind of underlying small differences don't matter sort of heuristic is operating kind of under the radar, and it is getting people into a lot of trouble, as you can see, and so although I mean for sure people can sense that something is going wrong here, but the difficulty, I mean, one thing that I've found very striking in a lot of philosophical discussions of it is that people will say things like, oh, it's built into the concept of a heap, that if n grains make a heap, then n minus 1 grains make a heap. I mean, they kind of regard that as in some way a conceptual truth about the concept of a heap, and that just strikes me as a manifestation of the way in which our kind of philosophical toolkit is impoverished, that we don't have some kind of that we don't have the category of a heuristic that we can use to see that these there's an alternative way of thinking about what these tolerance principles are, which is not that they're not analytic, because that's the kind of thing that philosophers have been trained to sort of regard as a an option, but that they're just heuristics. And I think the problem is that philosophers haven't even had this category of heuristics to think of as an alternative way of understanding what these principles actually are.
I think that maybe better illustration for heuristics would be gambler's paradox. So you're throwing the dice, throw, and you believe that every time you throw it, that the probability that desired number
Yes.
get is higher and higher and higher. However, it's not. Every time
Yes.
it's the same. Though there is something psychologically compelling about it. So these heuristics, probably falsely applied, does resemble to Miller-Lyer's illusion. You can't help yourself, you do have that feeling somehow, somewhere. So that would maybe be better psychological illustration of heuristics.
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to say what the heuristic was, because it's not, we're not likely to have a some kind of human general cognitive heuristic that is specially designed for things like long sequences of coin tossing or whatever, because that's such a specific phenomenon. I mean, I think it's not unlikely that that there is some kind of heuristic at work there, but I think one would have to be quite careful about what the heuristic was to make it one that it was actually psychologically plausible to postulate. But I mean, I think that case of the is actually yeah. I mean, it's one where we can quite easily see that when you think about the fact that the tosses are independent and so on, that the probabilities are not changing. And I think that it's actually not. I mean, it's not so like the Muller-Lyer in the sense that with the Muller-Lyer, they just the one line goes on looking longer than the other, even though you know perfectly well that they're the same length. But I mean, I don't find that that with something like coin tossing that my expectations go along along with the this kind of habit that you're describing, which is, I mean, it is a genuine thing that you find in some people that they, I mean, generally people not very educated in the relevant thing, that they expect that it's becoming more and more likely that let's say the coin will come up heads if it's been coming up tails. And but I think that's it's although that's quite widespread, it's not very difficult to, as it were, to get rid of that way of thinking. And I think on the whole, people who've been a little bit educated in some probability theory or whatever just don't have any lingering temptation to think that way.
Andrei.
Oh, just hi, Tim.
Hi,
Tim.
nice
Yeah,
to see you.
yeah. Well. First, I want to say that I find your book very interesting and very, very rich, and your arguments against the hyperintentionalism, which is really the mainstream view, very convincing, especially those in chapter 3, I believe, where you argue that various versions of hyperintentional semantics violate the compositionality constraint, and but then again, I have a strong feeling that there are cases which call for hyperintentional analysis, and an obvious case is mathematics, because I really cannot help but feel that different mathematical true sentences express different propositions. Say that a sentence about the sum of two numbers expresses a different proposition than a sentence about a particular value of a, I don't know, sine function or something like that. And in the last chapter of the book, you suggest really that all true mathematical statements express the same proposition only under different guises, and that these guises have cognitive significance, but they do not enter into meaning. And I don't know if is it really that when we are dealing with mathematics, when we are doing mathematics, that we are simply transforming one guise of a single proposition into some of its other guises. Is that all that we are doing? It seems to reduce the whole of mathematics and logic into a single proposition. Whereas on the other hand, when we are doing physics, we are really trying to do something quite different. We are trying to establish as many true contents, different contents as possible. And it kind of creates a very sharp divide between mathematics and logic on the one side and physics on the other, and which is to some extent really reminiscent of the old divide made by, say, Wittgenstein and logical positivists. And I mean, they said that mathematics is not at all about the world, and logic as well. I mean, you can say that single proposition is about the world, but still there's a single proposition, and all we are doing is really transforming its various guises into other guises. It kind of looks like that when we are doing mathematics, we are more doing something about I don't know, notational variants and things like that, then we are really discovering some more truths about the world. And that and kind of it makes mathematics really so to say, or at least that's my impression, a less worthy object of intellectual pursuit than, say, physics. And I have a problem with that. I have to say.
No, I mean, so I completely share your feeling that there's not such a great divide between mathematics and physics, and that in some sense that they're both equally concerned with reality. So, I think one way of as it were, getting an entering wedge here is, if you think about the role of mathematical derivations, which of course are used in physics as well as in mathematics, because when we're as it were making predictions from a theory, we're deriving stuff from the theory, plus probably auxiliary assumptions as well, but we're still doing mathematical derivations in both. And when you start thinking about mathematical derivations, it's although of course they're not fully formal in either physics or in mathematics actually most of the time, but there is a kind of formal aspect of them, which means that the derivations can be in principle checked by a computer in in kind of standard cases, and that kind of issues about form are actually sort of explicitly at the level of the linguistic form. I mean, just as a very simple case, that if we're using let's say modus ponens or disjunctive syllogism or something, I mean, whether something is an instance of that depends on its linguistic form, so that we can't just completely abstract away to a level of content, and that applies to these derivations, whether they're being done in physics or in mathematics. The idea of a correct mathematical derivation is sensitive to linguistic form, and another, I think, clue as to why when we're not really dealing with something that's purely at the level of content in the case of derivations is that in a typical mathematical derivation, you're using variables, you know, I mean, you're writing an equation with variables in it, and those variables are they simply have not been assigned a specific value because this is all implicitly general, and so if if you're dealing with an equation which where there are variables, then the equation isn't going to have a well-defined content because there's no specific values of the variables for to give the content. But at the same time, it's also not meant to be just a universal generalization, because it's all relative to certain assumptions. And so, I mean, if people have tried to overcome this by, weird, postulations of arbitrary objects and that kind of thing, but it doesn't seem a very plausible account of what's going on in proofs. So I think that, in mathematics but also in those parts of physics which are, are somewhat, where things are being done mathematically, there are quite a lot of indicators so that we're not really working just at the level of some kind of pure content, where the linguistic form in the specific way that it takes with mathematical notation is actually quite relevant. And just as it were to, I mean, I think to explain a bit more, I think this notion of the term content is, it is a bit misleading because it's still supposed to be, governed by, some kind of, cognitive constraints or something like that, which, but which, as I was arguing in the book, raise all sorts of problems. But if we were working in a purely extensional context, which in effect we're doing in mathematics a lot of the time because we're not concerned with modal issues there, then the equivalent of these coarse-grained propositions would simply be truth values, and the so that if you think of propositions as the as something like something quite like truth values, only adapted to a modal setting. That I think that may give a better sense of what they're doing. And I mean, the other thing I would say is that although if you just look at the level of propositions, of course mathematics can look very trivial, but as soon as you think about properties and relations, the semantics, of this intensional kind, it's not at all trivializing, because the mathematical properties are things which are genuinely possessed by by some mathematical objects and not by others. That there's a mathematical relation between a set and its members, and and that's a relation which relates in some cases and doesn't relate in others. So that if you think about the subject matter of mathematics, not just in terms of a bunch of propositions, but in terms of the properties and relations that we're studying, then those are highly non-trivial and differentiated, and just as differentiated as we would need them to be. So that I think in a way, it what may be going wrong here is trying to to think of the subject matter in terms of propositions rather than in terms of things like properties and relations or something of that kind. And then once you think in those terms, that mathematics is the study of certain kinds of properties and relations, and physics of others, the related ones, there just isn't the same kind of difference between them, and I think that enables one to see that these are both disciplines which are fully concerned with exploring reality and not just playing trivial verbal games.
Okay, thank you. And but can I go further and ask another question, and perhaps
Sure.
Boran, yeah, or
Circle.
we are going in circles. Okay, then I'll save it for later then. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my answers to the questions are a bit long, but
Vito.
Okay, thanks. So my first question is a bit similar to the ones Ksenia asked, but still I think it's still a bit different. So I'm going to ask you anyway. So it seems that in your book, particularly in chapter 1, you cautioned against premature rejection of philosophical theories based on isolated counterexamples, as a Popperian falsificationist framework would suggest.
yes.
And it seems to me that your view could potentially resonate with the Kuhnian notion of paradigm shifts, which Ksenia to an extent already kind of asked you, where a dominant paradigm is typically replaced by a new one only after accumulating substantial anomalies or counter evidence. So given this analogy and considering the debate that you quite extensively went through in your book between intentionalism and hyperintensionalism, could we interpret these as competing philosophical paradigms? And if so, does your argument suggest that the victory of one over the other will depend not on a single decisive counterexample, but on the gradual accumulation of evidence that better fits one framework, as it is the case with the Kuhn's paradigm shifts?
Yes, I mean, I think my answer to that is basically a very definite yes. And I think that that quite a lot of the arguments that were given for hyperintentionalism did make the mistake of thinking that all you really needed was one clear counterexample, and that would be enough to refute intentionalism in general. And I think that's just a mistake about philosophical methodology, and that also that as it were, a failure to recognize the way in which what feel like very clear judgments about examples can be generated by heuristics that are not 100% reliable, and so that's what I've been arguing is going on. And I think the the other aspect of this is that again in Kuhnian terms is that proponents of the hyperintensional paradigm are they're trying to kind of accumulate explanatory successes and so on, and but in my view it's not going that well, because what we see is a sort of accumulation of a lot of very complicated and different hyperintensional models, none of which is actually becoming the standard hyperintensional approach. I mean and I mean the kind of explanatory successes of really hyperintensional semantics are very limited, and and it does look quite like overfitting. So yeah, I'm completely on board with the idea of thinking that this is as it were, well, think I described the so-called hyperintensional revolution as an attempted coup, and and it's an attempted coup which has been actually going on for about 30 years now, and it's just not very I mean it's not established complete dominance or anything, but of course it has been very popular.
Yeah, thanks.
Mattia.
Hi there. So my question will go somewhere along the following lines. So in the chapter Overfitting and Degrees of Freedom, within the context of the JTB analysis of knowledge, we find the following quote. A different way to assess the plausibility of JTB is by noting that knowledge is a central focus for our ordinary thought and talk about cognitive matters. Is justified true belief a good candidate to play that role? End quote. It is claimed here that the term or concept of knowledge has a specific role or function it fulfills in our everyday lives. We should therefore evaluate knowledge as JTB on the basis of such a function. If I understood you correctly, you conclude that JTB does not fulfill this function in a satisfactory manner, which is one of the reasons why we should drop the JTB analysis of knowledge. Such a move reminds me of the recent methodology of conceptual engineering, the practice of assessing and improving our concepts. Authors working within this framework argue that if a concept fails to fulfill its function in a satisfactory manner, we should then revise or replace said concept. However, authors working on conceptual engineering also claim that concepts are not the only objects of our evaluation. We can also evaluate the functions they are intended to fulfill. Therefore, a friend of the JTB analysis of knowledge working within the framework of conceptual engineering might claim that although our concept of knowledge currently fulfills a function X, it should actually fulfill another function Y. It is this function Y that is best satisfied by the JTB analysis of knowledge. So I'm curious if you would find this line of argumentation convincing, which would come from the conceptual engineering side of things, or do you think this is, I don't know, not necessarily convincing?
Yeah. So what the kind of thing that you're suggesting is not totally different from a suggestion made by Brian Weatherson in a paper about 20 years ago about counterexamples and philosophical intuitions and so on, where he said, maybe JTB cuts at the kind of underlying joints better than the concept of knowledge does. So, well, several. I mean, of course, it's not very clear what this function of knowledge should be that JTB would serve, and in some papers that I think I refer to in the book, I have done some work on exploring formal models of JTB and seeing how the notion of some kind of JTB notion works formally, and it actually it doesn't really work very well at all. It gives you very kind of some sort of very inelegant thing that is, I would say, of no particular use to anybody. So one general thing about the function of knowledge, and this is one, is that that knowledge is something that we use in mind reading, in the psychological sense, other people so we understand other people in part by attributing knowledge to them, and it turns out that I think the psychological evidence is that the using knowledge in that way is actually much easier for not just for humans but for other animals as well than talking about justified true belief. I mean children grasp what knowledge is, several years before they can fully grasp what belief is. And there seem to be a lot of non-human animals that do have some kind of basic distinction between what other animals know and what they don't know. But there's no way that they don't have some kind of notion of belief, and they certainly don't have any notion of justified true belief. So that in that sense, the category of knowledge is much more available, and I think it's not actually very mysterious why that is, because when you're talking about what somebody knows, you're talking about how they're related to their environment, roughly speaking, and that's something which is relatively easy to observe. I think a paradigm is our knowledge of what other people can see, and so we can see what others can see and what they can't see, and so on. Whereas your knowledge of what they believe, that's much harder to know, because what they believe may be detached from their environment in a way that what they know isn't. And I think I say something more about this in the section on heuristics for knowledge in the book. But when one goes through what is what would be an efficient heuristic for attributing states of knowledge or belief, the knowledge is actually much more straightforward, because it's kind of, it can be attributed on the basis of some kind of heuristic where the default is that as it were, the world is open to view, and then where you then have to, of course, inhibit that default in cases where it's clear that there are limitations. Whereas attributing belief involves something much more heavyweight about attributing clashing perspectives on beliefs that don't fit to the world and so on. So that I think as a kind of, for purposes of basic efficiency in understanding others' cognitive states, I think there's a lot of evidence that knowledge is much better as a starting point than attributing any kind of belief related thing. So that so I don't think it's illegitimate for people as it were in principle to argue that maybe JTB is a great piece of conceptual engineering, even if it's not the way that we naturally think. But I think there's lots of evidence that actually it just can't do the job in that we do by knowledge ascription, where we need to be actually pretty good at ascribing knowledge. And I think if you had a bunch of people who went round just trying to focus on attributing justified true belief to each other, they would simply get into a mess. And I think that's, actually, I think this is very often the case with proposals for conceptual engineering, that they're just totally psychologically unrealistic, and that what's being proposed is something that couldn't be a natural way for humans to think at all. And when you look up some of the kind of very elaborate, complicated redefinitions of ordinary words, they're ones where you'd have to ordinary people would simply be unable to apply them. It would, in the same way that ordinary people, have a lot of difficulty applying very complex legislation to everyday cases. You'd, as it were, if we we followed all these recommendations for conceptual engineering, people would have to spend all their time, on the phone to their local philosopher asking how this conceptually re-engineered definition applied to give a given case.
Okay, thanks. This was really informative. Thank you.
Okay, can proceed to second round circle. I have a question related to this issue. You have an argument. I find it very, very interesting argument, but I don't know what to think about. It's a general argument against conceptual analysis. And the argument is that normal average people are using concepts like knowledge, causation, action, and so on. And philosophers have complicated analysis of that. So your argument is that's not what people have in their minds when they're using these concepts. It's so artificial, unrealistic, and people who use these concepts, they are, I don't know, they are competent speakers with normal cognitive capacities. That is simply not what they have in their minds. Okay, but this, let's take analogy, numbers, addition. We go to the market, we buy potato, tomato, whatever, and we are adding 4 plus 3 and so on. Well, addition has properties, mathematical properties like associativity, commutativity, distributivity, and so on. But that is not what average man on a market has in mind when he is adding 4 and 3. But nevertheless, it seems completely legitimate that mathematicians are analyzing the addition. So by analogy, it may be completely legitimate that epistemologists are analyzing knowledge with safety conditions, sensitivity conditions, justified true belief, causation, whatever.
Yeah, but one has to distinguish between conceptual analysis and other forms of analysis. So what mathematicians do is they're studying addition. Then they're not studying the lay people's concept of addition. I mean, they're not interested. They're just trying to produce a good theory of addition, and and depending on exactly on the mathematical setting, but what one can provide some kind of mathematical definition, maybe in set theoretic terms of addition, and that's a perfectly good form of theorizing, but it's not an attempt to explain the ordinary concept of addition. And now if you apply that to, let's say, the case of knowledge, yes, it is possible for somebody to say, look, I'm not interested in the ordinary concept of knowledge. I'm just interested in what knowledge is. And so this would be maybe a form of analysis that's like analyzing water as basically H2O, which of course isn't to do with how ordinary people thought about it, but just to do with what knowledge, with what water is, and then they can they can say, look, I just want to understand what knowledge is. Fair enough, but it's just that people then they kind of give that as their revised claim of what all these proposed accounts of knowledge are, like JTB and all the more complicated ones. And I think it's, it's perfect. It's true that you can, if you want to, you can think of these not as proposals for a conceptual analysis, but just as proposals for, for what knowledge really is. But they're incredibly unilluminating ones, and as well as the fact that there seem to be counterexamples to them. But these sorts of analyses, they don't really have any explanatory value, and there's no special reason in advance to think that you could characterize the knowledge in terms of belief and other factors. I mean, somebody can try it if they want to, but there's no special reason for expecting there to be such an analysis. And in the case of mathematics, what vindicates the projects of giving a mathematical theory of addition or whatever is just the fact that these are have fantastic explanatory power. I mean, they unify thinking about addition and make it systematic and reduce it to just a small number of basic principles or whatever. In a theoretically extremely satisfying way. Whereas there's absolutely no success that these attempts to characterize what knowledge is in terms of belief have. I mean, they're all. It's not just that they all seem subject to counterexamples, but none of them has managed to explain anything very much. So they're in that way, they just don't have the kind of credit that the mathematical proposals have.
Andrei.
Well, yes, this is really the continuation of the previous question, and it seems to me that the main argument in your book is really that that hyperintensional semantics, that various versions of hyperintensional semantics are not compositional, and that we shouldn't really give up on compositional semantics just in order to be able to accommodate several counterexamples in metaphysics. That would be too high price to pay, especially when we can really explain away the counterexamples by appealing to different heuristics. And but then I was wondering, I mean, what if a compositional hyperintensional semantics suddenly appeared? I mean, what would your diagram? I mean, would you then, I don't know, retract your views about the convincingness of these characteristic examples in metaphysics, say that those are fine and those derived from Aristotle and etc., or not? I mean, because I strongly feel that the main issue with hyperintentionalism is here that the semantics is not compositional, and that the story about different heuristics is really there to explain why we find several examples of intentionally indistinguishable sentences as being different in truth value, and appealing to heuristics should really explain that impression as a wrong impression. And but then what if a compositional semantics, hyperintensional semantics were constructed?
Yeah, but I mean, so the appeal to compositionality isn't the only thing that's doing the work there, and so for example, in the case of some versions of truthmaker semantics, it is actually compositional. If you allow it to have both verification conditions and falsification conditions. I mean, actually, I mean, I argue that it's not, although it's kind of technically compositional, it's not really in the spirit of compositionality because there isn't really a compositional explanation of negation, although that's kind of somewhat concealed by the way that the whole thing is based on a sort of having independent truth maker and falsity maker conditions. And you know, I think that the and with some versions of even with the impossible world semantics, it can be compositional, and there are kind of, you know, the thing, you know, the compositionality is not a super precise notion because, you know, often it turns out that there are kind of trivializing ways of technically satisfying the letter of compositionality, and you know, and some of those have been used in the case of you know, to defend semantics with impossible worlds, and so I think in a way, compositionality is a kind of form of barrier to overfitting that has, you know, has been one of the important constraints in the development of formal semantics, and you know, and I think that it's been fruitful because people haven't just regarded it as a purely technical constraint, but they're looking for, you know, proposals that will kind of respect the spirit of compositionality. So, as I say, in a way, this is one kind of form that bars overfitting, and so if somebody came along with some new form of hyperintensional semantics that was really very elegant and simple, but also properly constrained, and that just had hyperintentionality as a kind of byproduct. I mean, that would be worth, you know, that would be something that one should take seriously. I mean, I would also, in the case of some sort of semantics that maps interprets propositions as kind of Russellian propositions, where the you know, proposition is some sort of structure of a complex of the properties and relations and objects and so on that it's about. I mean, that doesn't have to be totally non-compositional, although it turns out it's not, you know, it's very difficult to make it fully compositional. But you know, I think that it could be that somebody will come along with such a theory, but I don't see much sign of one. And this, after all, this is something that people have been sort of actively investigating for the last 30 years, and you know, I don't think it's likely that there'll be some really, you know, smooth way of, you know, simple way of doing it. But I think that would have been found by now, given how many smart people have been looking for it. So, but I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, the kind of assessments that I'm making are ones which, you know, have to do with what the current state of the field is and what evidence we now have. And I mean, it's possible. It's, you know, I mean, nobody can rule out just for certain that things will still be looking the same way or in 20 years' time.
Yep. Thank you.
Philip.
Thanks. Well, I have perhaps a silly question, but I'll ask it nevertheless. So, well, I'm bothered by these by the counterpossibles, and it seems to me that we accept the truth of counterpossibles that anything goes, so that we can have anything. And but if we accept it, then we are also losing something. Then we'd lose, I think, reductio ad absurdum. Well, in reductio ad absurdum, we accept the claim by rejecting the opposite, as the opposite leads to a contradiction. However, if we accept counterpossibles in which we treat the antecedent as true, even though it is impossible, aren't we in fact accepting and building on something that we just typically do not endorse, which we usually see as an endpoint of discussion, as an endpoint of the reductio ad absurdum argumentation? So isn't that a way perhaps to just put a stop to the talk about counterpossibles, or am I just being silly and naive?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about something like reductio ad absurdum, I mean that's a form of proof. I mean, what a very good form of proof, which of course is widely used in mathematics. And I mean, in my view, it's reductio ad absurdum is more than a heuristic. It's actually it's a valid principle of logic. But in understanding how it works, one has to make the distinction between as it were, what's going on epistemically and what's going on at the level of the kind of underlying contents. So that when you make a hypothesis, for an argument by reductio ad absurdum, let's say the hypothesis that there are only finitely many prime numbers, that hypothesis is, as it were, it's implicitly absurd, but it's not explicitly absurd. And I mean, from the point of view of the proof as something that brings knowledge, we start off in a position where, at least where initially we don't know whether this thing is the case, and then we derive a contradiction from it, and so now we know that it's not the case, and the proof can be summed up, in some kind of counterfactual, that if there were infinitely many prime numbers, if there were only finitely many prime numbers, then let's say if p were the largest prime, then factorial p plus 1 would be both prime and not prime, or something like that. So we can sum up the proof in a counterfactual, which is quite a natural way of just summarizing the proof. Of course, once we've done the proof, we know that that it couldn't be that there's a largest prime, but and so in a sense, the counterfactual, once we know that the antecedent is impossible, the counterfactual kind of becomes interesting. I'm sorry, becomes boring, but I mean it's still true, but utterly uninteresting because it's got an impossible antecedent. But it still played a legitimate epistemological role in enabling us to come to know that there is no largest prime number, and that's what it's kind of signaling when we summarize the argument. And so and I think that this, in principle, this kind of distinction between what's going on at the sort of semantic and metaphysical level on the one hand, and what's going on at the epistemic level, that's something that is widely accepted in the literature on conditionals. I mean, for example, David Lewis, makes quite a bit of it in his book on counterfactuals.
Okay, thanks.
Just a small true anecdote about counterpossibles. I live close to the forest, and I asked hunters about if pigs were flying, we would need a different kind of ammunition to hunt. And hunters, they all agreed that it is true. It's true statements. And they were starting explaining me the calibers, the diameter of the shells, and so on. So, okay, your own veto.
Thanks. So the second question I want to ask is connected to your last chapter, chapter 5, and the guises that you are linguistic guises that you're referring to. So if I interpreted your chapter 5 right, you argue that cognitive significance does not supervene on semantic properties,
Yes.
as illustrated by the Furs and Gores example. And you emphasize that linguistic guises or the specific forms in which content is expressed play a crucial role in cognitive significance. And that allows for distinct cognitive relations to necessarily equivalent propositions.
Yes.
So you advocate for a radical separation of content and cognitive significance.
Yes.
And given this, how does your framework account for the cognitive value of learning new linguistic guises for previously understood concepts, particularly in metaphysics, logic, mathematics, where necessary equivalents are prevalent? And how does the recognition of linguistic guises as what we think with rather than what we think enable us to understand the acquisition of new cognitive relations to old truths without conflating these relations with changes in semantic content?
Yeah. So, I mean, supposing we take the water is H2O example, and I mean, let's just assume that that's the correct identity, and in fact that it's you know, but by the necessity of identity, that it's actually a necessary truth that water is H2O. So now we've got this this new guise under which we can think about water as H2O, and this new guise is kind of connected to the whole of chemical theory, via because it connects water with hydrogen and oxygen, and so that via this new guise for thinking about the same thing, it's actually hooked up to a very, very powerful theories which enable us to understand things about water. And so even in the the case of, let's say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the fact that when you learn that Dr. Jekyll is also Mr. Hyde, that casts a completely new light on this character who seemed very respectable and well behaved and so on. And so the thing is so these these new guises but both for individuals and objects and propositions, although they're just guises for the very same thing, they have different cognitive connections, and at least in many cases, and so that what you're getting when you gain a new guise for something is a whole lot of further cognitive connections that you may not have had before. It's just that what I'm resisting is the idea that that it's got to be possible to find a level of content at which all these cognitive connections can be understood. I think that's what we have to understand is that when we're talking about the epistemology and cognition, that form as well as content plays a really important role.
Thanks.
Mattia.
Okay, so my next question is specifically about the persistence heuristic. I think we already mentioned it
Yes.
in this discussion. So the question is as follows. When we apply the persistence heuristic to vague terms or concepts, then it leads us to Socrates' paradoxes, because vague terms do not have clear boundaries or defeaters, and we apply the heuristic iteratively. However, it seems at least prima facie plausible to claim that we could continue using the heuristic in these cases if we would ameliorate these vague terms. I would claim that when we talk about the persistence heuristic, we actually want to maximize the use of such a heuristic, so we can use our cognition more efficiently, while at the same time minimize the danger that vague or otherwise inconsistent terms or concepts pose to us. Therefore, we can think of I don't know, mix of conceptual analysis or conceptual engineering or whatever you want to call it, as in a sense complementing the use of at least the persistence heuristic. So I'm curious about what your response would be, if there is any, I don't know, such a connection between a kind of conceptual analysis or conceptual engineering and our use of particular heuristics.
Well, if what you're thinking is that we could make these vague terms more precise, then I think in most situations the cost of doing that is to make them incapable of serving their normal function. Because, so for example, in the case of heap, you could, I mean, suppose you could give some more precise definition that might, be roughly equivalent. And but you'd have to say something about, how many, let's say, how many grains, and how the grains had to be stably resting on, some grains had to be stably resting on other grains for it to be a heap, and so on. And so you could say something about the, roughly speaking, the physics and dynamics of heaps. But that wouldn't be the notion of heap that we could just standardly use, because when we're talking about heaps, where we want to be able to to recognize a heap when we see one, not 100% of the time, but as it were, that most of the time we can recognize whether something is a heap or not just by looking at it. And so having a precise definition there wouldn't really have any useful effect. I mean, of course, what's true is in the for example, in legal contexts, it's very important to have terms where we that will not give rise to a whole lot of borderline cases. And so sometimes, for example, if it's a question of, who counts as an adult, by, for the purposes of some piece of legislation about voting or, sex or whatever it is, then we artificially introduce a cutoff point for, adult at, as soon as you become 18 or whatever it is. And so those kind of localized and precisified versions are useful for very specific purposes. But vague, for the most of the purposes for which we use vague terms, having a formal definition would be useless. I mean, if either we would just ignore the formal definition in the way that we use the term, or else we would it would be, using it would be such a sort of clumsy and difficult thing to do that we would have to stop using the term for most purposes.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. So it's already, well, it's here 1:43, 45. So I don't know, Tim, whether
well, like if we go on to 2 o'clock your time, which is 1 o'clock by my time, then that's fine by me.
Good, thank you. Well, there is we have an argument or something about the hyperintensional explanations, that the sentence, the snow is white, is true because snow is white. And then it seems that you want to explain away this because by appeal to pragmatics of explanation. It seems that you want to say that this because is not part of the world, it's not objectively out there. However, we had a feeling that no matter what amount of pragmatics of explanations you do, this because is still there objectively out there that you cannot remove it.
Well, I mean, can you say anything about what this feeling is based on?
It's a classical rationalist a priori intuition. You're looking at this, the sentence no is right is true because no is right. And you can't help yourself. It's just like that, like demonstration in geometry. So
yeah. But I'm not, but I'm not suggesting that that's that has to be false. I'm all the time suggesting is that these, I mean, when we're deciding which because statements to accept, the heuristic that we use has to do with what is explanatorily helpful, and so I'm as is what I'm so I mean, and these judgments will not always be correct, but as a judgment about the truth value of a because claim, if the because claim really has just a standard semantics, and actually, and a lot of this doesn't really even depend on whether one's intentional or hyperintentional, but so that, for example, if one example I was giving was some things like somebody asks why is furs just as widespread as gorse, and then you tell them, well, that's because furs is gorse. I mean, that's a perfectly good explanation, and but the content of what you said, that furs is gorse, is exactly the same as if you'd said furs is furs, but on most semantic theories. And this, for this, one's not just talking about intentionalism. This is actually true on a lot of standard hyperintensional theories. But in fact, and these are theories which make the content be about the world, and then it will just be that an informative sentence like furs is gorse and an uninformative sentence like furs is furs, they will have the same content because they're both about the world, and it's the same thing that you're talking about twice over. So they're not going to differ in content, and so the point is that the differences in how helpful an explanation is are sensitive to differences in form where there's no difference in content, and those differences play a large role in our judgments about which because claims to accept and which to reject, and so that the problem is that our assessments of these because claims, I mean, of course, they're partly about the world, but they're also very sensitive to cognitive aspects of the situation. It's to do with what is actually epistemically helpful for somebody who's asking a given question.
Thank you, Andre.
Well, here's a question really, which is a follow-up to something that Philip mentioned. Is well, I'm not quite sure how we identify heuristics. I mean, is it transparent to us which heuristics we're using? And
no, it's not.
No. So we can go wrong in identifying which heuristics we're using. And it seemed to me that the heuristics that you mentioned, they're quite diverse. There's the supposition heuristics, and there is the there is the why heuristic, and there is the belief ascription heuristic, and they're quite different. When I take a closer look at the why heuristic, which Boran mentioned in the last example, and it's well, it looks like it covers several different heuristics, because it says that we are kind of projecting the pragmatics of posing questions and giving answers and into semantics, but we can really project quite different aspects of that dialogical setting. And isn't it the case that we will then be left with several different heuristics, or not, perhaps? And can it be that ascribing heuristics is really liable to those kind of skeptical questions, as there could be several overlapping heuristics which would fit the data about our actual behavior quite well and identically, basically, but they could still be different heuristics. So how do we really tell which heuristics we're using? And that's
well, so I think these are, as it were, high-level psychological hypotheses about what is going on, and you know, and they are susceptible to you know, investigation, you know, even experimental investigation. I mean, I haven't been doing that kind of investigation because I'm more concerned to get these hypotheses on the table and kind of, as it were, theoretically worked out than to do all the experimental work. But and so I mean, these questions, you know, will certainly arise, you know, for psychology as well, about how psychologists individuate heuristics. In the specific case that you mentioned of the explanatory, the why heuristic. So the basic idea is to assess because claims in terms of how helpful we would find the, you know, the corresponding answer to a question, you know, given that we were in the position of wanting or needing to ask the question. And of course, you know, and I think it's probably true that that, you know, a whole bunch of different pragmatic and epistemic factors will play into how helpful an answer is to a question, and you know, and so will affect what judgments we make about because statements. I don't think that this means that there are different heuristics involved. It just means that there are different factors, you know, that influence, you know, how helpful an explanation is. I mean, an explanation is a kind of quite complex cognitive act, and with different aspects to it. So you know, I think it's as far as I can see, it's fundamentally the same heuristic, but it's just that applying it will evoke, you know, different sorts of considerations in different cases. But of course, you know, if somebody wants to make the case that there are actually several different heuristics here which are mutually independent, and you can easily have some of these heuristics without others, I mean, they can go ahead and try to make that case. But I think on the basis of the evidence and the cases that I've seen, it seems adequate to treat this as a single heuristic.
Okay, thanks.
We have a few more minutes. Does anybody has an urge to ask or comment something? If not, then I will misuse my position about supervenience. It seems, if I get you right, it seems that you are rejecting the notion or the concept tool of supervenience because it's supposed to be asymmetrical, but actually analysis shows that this is not asymmetrical. Analysis shows that this is symmetrical. think that there is something wrong with that analysis. Well, the concept of supervenience was initially meant as asymmetrical. So if you cannot change A properties without changing B properties, that means that A properties depend on B properties, not other way around. Now, how my feeling is, some vague general feeling is that argumentation goes this way. So, well, A is supervenes of B, but then we introduce a border case where B also supervenes on A. You see, the relation is symmetrical, it's not asymmetrical. But that holds for many other relations, say subset. Initially and intuitively, subset is an asymmetrical relation. However, we can introduce the assumption that set can be subset of itself, and then it's over. Then the relation of subset becomes a symmetrical relation. And the same holds for ground.
Yeah, I don't think symmetrical is the right word. I think you just mean that it's not asymmetric, but because if it was a symmetric relation, then it would have to be that whenever X is a subset of Y, then Y is a subset of X. But I mean that nobody thinks that. So I think we're just talking about the difference between asymmetric relations and ones which are not asymmetric, and so in the case of supervenience, it was given a modal definition, just as that you can't change A without changing B, roughly speaking. And of course, and the trouble with that modal definition is it doesn't give you asymmetry, because asymmetry implies irreflexivity, that nothing is supervenes on itself, and which is what people had in mind by dependency. But of course, if in the trivial, I mean the relation of between A and B, when you can't change A without changing B, that's trivially reflexive, because you can't change A without changing A, and so it doesn't quite have the formal properties that you wanted it to have. And of course, the kind of initial move is just to say, well, we could define as an asymmetric notion of dependence, saying via supervenience, by just saying that it's a case where X supervenes on Y, but Y does not supervene on X, and that will be automatically asymmetric and irreflexive. But it turns out that there are, I think I maybe even mentioned some in the book, that there are examples where you have that kind of asymmetric supervenience, but where there our kind of judgment is that that this isn't a case of dependence of the kind that we wanted, and so I think that the what was going on there was that people were wanted to capture dependence. They gave a definition in terms of a modal definition, as supervenience, and then maybe as asymmetric supervenience, which captured a lot of the cases, but they didn't capture all of them. And I mean, my own view is that the reason they didn't capture all of them was because these judgments of dependency, I mean, in ways very close to what I was saying about the because judgments, are they're very sensitive to explanatory considerations, and the explanatory considerations are are judgments about them, because they're so sensitive to these sort of explanatory issues, are likely to not to be fully consistent with each other, and so that I think might be that supervenience is actually or maybe asymmetric supervenience is the best that you can get in this area. But of course, there's a massive literature on, postulating new relations of, grounding and so on to try to make sense of all of that. But I think it may be a quicksand.
Well, so 2:00. Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time and your energy spent on us. So, well,
thank you for all the interesting questions.
well, we went.
Thank you.
We really did.
Thank you.
Yeah.